Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Purblind Gamer stream. A special stream, because this will be the last night that we read that strange book from the 1920s, CRATER'S GOLD, by Philip Curtis. If for no other reason than that we will have finished the book, and I don't propose to read it through a second time on stream. Nothing against the book, but there are other things one could read. So this won't be a long stream, because, as usual, I'm starting later than intended, and have work tomorrow. God, there's too much I have to deal with. But there's too much we all have to deal with. Welcome to adulthood. It's overrated. Or is it? The neighbors are setting off fireworks tonight. That'll be fun. But I hope everybody's week is going well. Mine's a little bit crazy. We just got... A surprising number of stuff came in today in particular that must be dealt with, let's say. But thank you to everybody who came out to my last couple of streams. On Sunday, Sunday, we played more of the Doom reboot, right. And then we missed Saturday because I was working out technical issues, and on Wednesday, we finished Iron Roses. And we won't ever have to play that again. We can if we want to. And this book has taken a few twists and turns. That a rather long, shaggy dog story about about this certain tavern's flip, which is a type of drink they had in the 1800s and still have today. I looked it up afterwards. I want to try it. That was a 20-page diversion? Oh boy. Still not as bad as the one I had in the book I did my thesis on. But I digress. Why am I always congested? And as a reminder, because I'm reading an audiobook, which I will eventually edit together and put on LibriVox for people to listen to on their MP3 players or something, I will not be responding to chat until after I'm finished reading, and I'll have TTS turned off. Obviously won't have explosions turned off, and I'll have raids disabled. Chapter 29. My gosh, it's somebody's ocean, all right, agreed Exberger as, a pace in advance of the others, he reached Baumgarten's side. Wait a minute, I'll light a match. So you've got one now, have you? Asked Baumgarten. First thing I looked for when I got upstairs, admitted Exberger. He lit the match, and it did the duty that even the tiniest flame will do on a windless night. As far ahead as its faint glow would reach, it showed water, smooth water, like a lake in the ditches and fields, muddy water in snake-like tricklets with edges of dirty bubbles, curling and searching its way towards their feet in every wheel track and hoof print. They had to move back a step to avoid it. Exberger, with a fine show of prodigality, lit another match as soon as the first had expired. Water, water everywhere, he quoted. And not continued Styles, but Baumgarten interrupted him. Yes, we know about all that, he said gruffly. acting as guardian to these irresponsible children in the face of natural phenomena, was rapidly making him a nervous wreck. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" "Ask Styles," suggested Exberger. "It's his flood." Baumgarten, however, paid no attention. Briefly, with the rights of the pioneer, he related the facts of his discovery. Striding along the road ahead of the others, he had walked into what he had thought was a puddle, but, jumping to clear it, had merely jumped into deeper water, up to his ankles, in fact. At that he had stopped and called for directions. "Of course it comes from the mine," said Styles. "They must have turned on the water at the pond. They shut it off to allow us to salvage the car. The judge said that the mine was already full of water." "He didn't have to tell us that," interrupted Exberger. "We heard it ourselves, and saw it go in." "And then, when they let in still more water," continued Styles, regardless, "it must have been more than the poor mine could stand. It has spewed it out, belched it forth, as our lady novelists say when they wish to write with brute masculine vigor." Exberger turned in mock reproof. "Styles, your language is getting to be something awful." Styles laughed, for, ever since his impassioned lecture to Rose, it was true that his mind had been running in a sort of exalted and vicious rhythm. "Anyway," he said, in gruffer tones to prove his sanity, "the house is safe. You can see the lights." "Oh, those poor cows!" exclaimed Rose at the thought. "Do you think they're drowned?" "Not unless water can run uphill," replied Baumgarten. "That water is coming out of the mine, not going into it. If the water had reached to where they are, it would be 50 feet over our heads where we stand, 100 for that matter." Rose's attitude expressed her usual distrust of science, but she said no more. Exberger, the inquisitive, started to walk slowly forward, going as far as he could on the dry spots between the wheel tracks. Even when he came to the edge of the temporary lake itself, he splashed it daringly with his foot. He saw a hummock of sand surrounded entirely by water, and leaped over to it, but when he stood poised for further advance, it was too much for Rose. "Now, Charlie," she begged, "don't try to swim it." In Baumgarten, all sense of humor was dead. "Come back here, Charlie," he ordered curtly, and strangely Exberger did it. They all, in fact, had to beat a hasty retreat, for, as if the water had just discovered their presence, the little streamlet suddenly began to run toward them, as if with deliberate venom. The party was chased back a full dozen feet, at which the streamlets, amused at having shown their authority, began to content themselves with describing jigsaw patterns among the hoofprints. From the new point of vantage, Exberger surveyed the oncoming flood. "I wonder what we ought to do," he asked, musingly. "Do you suppose we ought to stick our finger in the dike, or ought we to run and give the alarm to the sleeping city?" "We ought to do something," said Baumgarten gruffly. "You seem to think this is a joke." "Well, isn't it in a way?" retorted Exberger. "As long as Fieldsy is safe and sound, I think it's awfully funny." "Funny as a crutch," answered Baumgarten bitterly. "I suppose you'd like to see somebody get drowned in it. It may be all right here, where it's level, but suppose somebody in a car was coming fast down that hill on the other side. That would be a fine joke, wouldn't it?" "The deuce! I never thought of that," replied Exberger, suddenly sobered. "Neither did I," confessed Styles. "Well, we've got to get up there, and get up there quick," commanded Baumgarten. "Are there any other roads, Styles?" "None that I know of." "Well, that doesn't prove that there aren't any," suggested Exberger, but Baumgarten checked him. "Come now, stop your talking. We've got to let somebody know about this." He turned and led the way to the crossroads at a pace which made the others almost break into a run. There he stopped and announced his plan of campaign. "There are 2 things to do," he said. "Go to the village, or else go down to that house there, where that light is. To be safe, we'll do both." "Wait a minute," said Exburger. "Here comes a car." In the distance, from the direction of the town, a pinpoint of light was rapidly enlarging into a pair of headlights. Exburger rushed into the middle of the road and began waving his arms. "I bet it's Puller," said Styles, and Puller it was. With a creaking of brakes, he came to a stop and looked out, astonished. Exburger did the talking. Puller heard him through and pondered the moment. "The quickest thing," he agreed at last, "is to go on to my house and telephone the judge. He's the man to talk to. Jump in." He seemed excited, but excited in a capable, resourceful way. Just to see him take charge of the case took a load from the shoulders of the others. In physical moments like that, Puller was at his best. "Jump in," he repeated. Puller's car was a runabout, just such a runabout as a man like Puller would drive, tiny in seating capacity, but in strength and power the size of a locomotive. It had no windshield and must have been gray. Rose sat in the seat, while the others, as Exburger said, proceeded to drape themselves on the mudguards. Puller stood on the throttle, and the wind began whistling past. "Are there any other roads to get up here?" called Baumgarten from where he sat half on the floor. Bending over his wheel, his eyes squinted at the road. Puller did not answer, and Rose leaned down to Baumgarten. "He didn't hear you," she said, and Baumgarten was, in his way, enough of a Puller not to repeat the question. In much less than a minute, Puller drew up in the gravel driveway before his own house. "Come in," he said, "and we'll see what's what." His house, as seen from the foot of the steps, did not seem a large one, but a soft red light in a window promised a certain pretentiousness, while the hallway they entered, with polished floors and a tiger-skin rug, was rather amazing. As if they had come for a casual call, their host showed them into the little reception room to which the red-shaded lamp invited. It was not an unusual room, as reception rooms go. For the modern taste, there might have been just a trifle too much of tapestry on the wall, a trifle at each end to stop traffic. For the modern taste, there might have been just a trifle too much of tapestry on the wall, a trifle too much of brass in the great lampstand, a trifle too much of crowding among the mahogany chairs and tables, but a deep, soft rug gave way underfoot, and, after 2 days of the old Crater house, it conveyed an astonishing sense of richness. Puller, calm as he was, did not let hospitality delay him. "If you will wait here," he suggested, with a smile and half a bow, and was gone. At the end of the hall they heard him call up the operator in his usual quiet tones. Then a door shut, and his voice was cut off. Exburger looked around the room with excited eyes. "Some shack!" he exclaimed, but no one gave any response, least of all Rose. Even in view of the emergency, she could not seem to get over a feeling of being an intruder in that house. "Why don't you sit down, Rose?" asked Baumgarten gently. "You're all wrought up." "I'm all right," said the girl, quietly, but as a concession to his kindly intent, she did sit stiffly on the edge of a chair. Exburger, all unconscious of anything except immediate impressions, was still surveying the room. "You'd never think, in a house like this, that you were way off in the country, would you?" he asked. "That just shows what you can do, Styles, if you know how to do it. When I have a house in the country, I'm going to have one just like this." Puller came back in time to hear his last words, and waited for him to finish. "It's all right," he said, with a smile. "The judge did it on purpose." "On purpose?" exclaimed Baumgarten. Puller nodded. "He says that the water is only about 18 inches deep in the road." 18 inches? Demanded Exburger, as if it were a personal affront to his private flood. "Has he seen it?" "No," exclaimed Puller, still with a smile, "but he says that it's happened before, in the reign of Martin Van Buren or somebody. The water can't run anywhere except across the meadows and on down into Cranberry River. He says it will all be gone by morning." "But how do you mean he did it on purpose?" insisted Exburger. He had to have the gate at the pond opened sooner or later, explained Puller. The water rights on the river belong to the power company. If it didn't run some time, we wouldn't have any electric lights. Besides, he said that was the quickest way to get the water out of the mine. If he hadn't done that, it would have been leaking out and making the roads mushy all summer. But isn't it dangerous? Exclaimed Baumgarten. Oh, recalled Puller, he asked me to apologize to you for cutting you off. He said he left you all safe at home. He stationed a man at each end to stop traffic. The man at this end must have fallen asleep at his post. I hope the one at the other end hasn't, suggested Baumgarten. He could still not get over his sense of responsibility. In the meantime, he added, how are we ever going to get home? That's simple, said Puller. I'll run you down to Lebanon and then back over the mountain. It's only 17 miles. At the rate we came, replied Exberger, that will take us just 17 minutes. Puller laughed. There's not all that hurry this time. I'll take the big car. If you'll wait just a minute, my wife will be down. On the heels of her husband's words, Mrs. Puller came into the room. She was dressed in a trailing silk that seemed to be half negligee and half tea-gown, and, with her own background, one had to confess that she made not at all an unqueenly figure. The moment was one which Styles had hoped to avoid, but Mrs. Puller, although a rigorous lady, was, after all, a lady. With every gesture of kindness, she swept up to Rose and took her hand. Her husband gave, briefly, the story. She listened with open eyes. "But you weren't scared?" she asked, turning again to Rose. Rose admitted that she had been, and things went more smoothly. Exberger only for a moment had allowed the picture of his hostess to take his eyes from the room. "Mrs. Puller," he said at the first opportunity, "you've got a really beautiful place." Mrs. Puller smiled. "Would you like to see it?" she asked him. "Isn't it pretty late?" suggested Styles. "You entertained us until 2 o'clock," she replied. She turned and led the way into the hall, then into the little breakfast room. It was finished in quaint Dutch tiles, while regiments of copper and pewter mustered themselves on the sideboard. They caught Exberger's eye at once. "I say," he exclaimed, "you know how to live." His hostess nodded an acknowledgment which was not without humor, and led the way to the back of the house. "And this," she explained, "is where Bobby lives when he's too cross to be seen." The room was a little den with a big leather chairs and tobacco jars and old faded photographs on the walls. Styles looked at them with a pang of reminiscence, pictures of hockey teams and crews, in all of which he could pick out Puller's own face, looking hardly more boyish than it looked now. "What year were you?" he asked quietly. 99, replied Puller. "Were you a New Haven man, too?" "Cambridge," said Styles. They spoke with the air of diffidence, that curious manner of shame with which university men do allude to such subjects, but Exberger overheard them and looked strangely from one to the other. "In 1899, he began, slowly, "I was—" But his tone drifted off. The sentence did not seem to be as important as he had thought at first it was going to be. His eyes caught sight of a picture of hounds, and he welcomed the diversion. "Say, Puller," he exclaimed, "perhaps you can tell us. What do they hunt with beagles?" "Rabbits," said Puller, surprised. "Why?" "Nothing," replied Exberger. "I just wanted to know." The party followed its hostess back into the hall. "This," she announced with a certain air, "is a room of which we are really proud." What she actually did was open a door and switch on some lights, but she seemed to have raised a great curtain, for the room which was opened before them was positively regal. It must have been 60 feet long and 30 feet high. A grand piano in the far corner suggested its character, while a winding staircase gave the idea that it was not so much a room as a whole wing of the house. On all 4 sides the walls were panelled white. At the height of the second story, a balcony ran about it. Above that, more panels. It glowed with soft, indirect lighting. The whole group stared at it with wide-open eyes. On each of the walls was a single painting. Styles looked amazed at his hostess. "Proud?" he exclaimed. "I should think you'd be positively pompous." "We don't use it much," she replied, with the same air of deprecation with which her husband had referred to his college pictures, but still an amused glint of pride shone in her eyes. Styles could well forgive it. His own eye was caught by one of the paintings. He looked again at his hostess and smiled. She returned it, and Styles shook his head. "No," he said slowly, "I don't believe it." He half expected Exberger to act in his usual role, but Exberger was looking up at the height of the walls and was dumb. Styles turned to Rose and nodded toward the painting. "You read about those," he said, "but you mustn't believe it, because there is no such animal. That is a genuine Claude Lorraine." "It belonged to my father," explained Mrs. Puller. It was a picture of which it needed no knowledge of painting to see the splendor. Puller turned on its own hooded light, and a golden flush brought out its rich tropic splendor. A full 3 minutes, in silence, the little group stood before it, drinking in the pure majesty of its spaces and columns. Mrs. Puller broke the silence at last. "I suppose it is very rococo now to love Claude Lorraine. People talk color." Styles shook his head. "I don't." At last Exberger spoke, but he did not speak as he usually spoke. He was blinking his eyes with excited interest. "How do you mean, talk color?" Mrs. Puller hesitated, then turned to Styles. "How would you describe it?" "Well," explained Styles, "the idea seems to be that if you paint a black horse on one half of your canvas and a white horse on the other, the eye will see a calico pony standing in the middle. It may be. It is very beautiful sometimes, morning lights and apple blossoms and blue mists, but it does seem as if the artist should do the work, not we. Personally, I prefer pictures." Exberger looked at the Claude Lorraine and drew a long breath. "Well, if that is a picture," he said at last, "so do I." They turned back into the hall, and Puller went out for his car. There was little said on the long drive home, and little said as they found their way into the house. Baumgarten was shown his room, and Styles went about his business of closing up for the night. Just as he had done on the evening before, he leaned down to turn out the big study lamp. Then again he looked up and saw Rose at his side. It would be rather ridiculous, however, to say that he had not known she was there. He paused a moment, leaving the room half-lighted. "You'd better find your way to the stairs," he suggested, "before I put this out." But the girl did not move. She looked up at him mischievously, and he suddenly found that his own hands were trembling. He looked at her with eyes as bright as her own. "I mentioned a little matter this afternoon," he suggested. A step sounded, coming down the stairway, and, guiltily, they sprang apart. Exberger came into the room. His voice was rather husky, and he was hanging his head. "By the way, Styles," he said, "I'd rather you didn't say anything to those people about my scheme for the movies. It might not be the thing after all." Chapter 30. His promise to Exberger Styles kept in the strict sense of the word, but the matter was mentioned. Puller mentioned it first. Styles found him at 10 o'clock on the following morning, seated in his little box of an office on the village street amid a fine show of business. It being Saturday, he explained that he had a few things to get off before the noon mail, and, dutifully, Styles sat waiting and watched him. There was something amusing in seeing Puller there at his desk, his tweed knickerbockers, his heavy hands, and his wind-blown cavalry officer's face appeared all wrong among the litter of carbon copies and inkwells and scattered papers. He looked like an over-serious child playing at business, which to a large extent was what he actually was. Or, better, he looked to Styles like one of those pictures in animal books, showing Big Master Dog, dressed up in a collar and tie, at work in his shop. Puller signed his last check and looked up. "Well, how is the flood?" "It has all disappeared," replied Styles. "The judge was quite right." "The judge always is," answered Puller quietly. "In 15 years I have learned that much." He paused thoughtfully, almost wistfully, and looked out of the window as if the judge would furnish food for an endless talk. Styles wondered whether Puller realized that year by year, almost week by week, he himself was becoming a judge, but he had little hope that he was going to find out, for a man like Puller is the most disappointing thing in creation for intimacy. Puller must have had dreams, endless dreams, as he looked out that window. Styles himself could build up processions of pictures just as he had watched him. Historic, Homeric boat races on the Thames at New London, self-suppressed, well-bred, triumphant university days at New Haven, country house visits with skating and hockey and undergraduate hero worship, the seemingly brilliant marriage to wealth, and then this. What hopes, disappointments, humors, ironies did Puller feel now at the thought of himself with all his background and all of his education being found thus cooped up in this grotesque box of a country office, fishing and motors his only excitements, petty transfers of land his sole occupation. There must have been longings, some wish for confession stifled under that firm, handsome face, but Styles knew that the creed of such men was never to show it. He was right. Puller said no more of the judge. "Any damage," he asked, "from the flood?" Styles smiled at the question. "The grass has a shampooed effect, lying flat with the white sides showing, and when I came down this morning, the roads were as smooth as a table, not a wheel track in them. There may be a fence or two gone." "Not the bridge?" "Not the bridge." It was all pure sparring to serve until Styles should choose to state the real purpose of his visit. He chose right away. "Puller," he said, "I'm ready to sell." Puller showed no emotion one way or the other, and Styles went on. "I imagine that you might feel, perhaps, a little hesitation in coming to see me again." "I did," confessed Puller. "I thought I had bothered you enough. Of course I will have to see my people." He said it in a way that roused in Styles a little resentment. "Of course you don't have to take it, you know, if you don't want it." Puller raised his hand. "Don't worry. We'll take it all right. That's not what I meant. You see, it's not my money." "I see," said Styles, and he did see all that Puller meant to have him. Perhaps that was why Puller himself came out of his shell just a little. He looked at Styles and smiled faintly. "Your friend made quite a speech last night." "So I heard." "Was he—" "He was vigorous," supplied Puller. "Enthusiastic." Styles smiled himself. "The word pep, they tell me, is used to describe the manner." He felt at that moment a sudden, huge impulse to smash straight through that reserve, to exclaim, "Now look here, Puller, what's the use of our being snobs and asses? Which one of us could have done 1/10 of what that fellow had done?" But, among the others of life, Styles had met several Pullers. In his faint, pedantic way, he knew that he was a bit of a Puller himself. To the extent of being a Harvard man, he certainly was, but, facing Puller, he always felt a little pro-Exberger, just as, facing Exberger, he always felt more than a little pro-Puller. Instead of following his impulse, he rose to his feet. "Well, whenever you wish to talk about it?" Puller looked at his watch. "I don't think it will take long. Would it be possible for you to come to the judge's house tonight?" Styles looked his surprise. "Then the judge is one of you?" "The judge," replied Puller, "is one of nobody. In this particular matter, His humor is to act with us. That is, it seems to be. Somewhat to my surprise, I will admit." Styles walked toward the door, and then it suddenly occurred to his host that he had forgotten a duty. "I say, Styles, we'll be awfully sorry to lose you." But that was too much. Styles laughed, and Puller laughed with him. From the porch of the little office, Styles saw Exberger wandering up the village street, looking from side to side, and wondering what part of it he would buy. The impresario had walked with him to town that morning to see what remained of the car. There survived, it seemed, more than he had dared to hope. $500 or $600, he announced as he reached Styles's side. "We'll put it right. It's a shame, but I'm lucky to get off with that much." They walked on, lazily, to the post office, where Styles found nothing more valuable than 3 glowing circulars praising gilt-edge industrial bonds. One day, apparently, after he had come into his inheritance, every broker in the country had found it out. He received advertisements from incredible places for brokers to be: Wagon Box, Arizona, and Lockport, New York. He threw the circulars into the street and fell into step beside his companion. "Exberger," he said suddenly, "which had you rather be, Puller or yourself?" Like most men, Exberger had an entirely different manner when talking to only one person. "That's a silly question," he said, but quietly enough. "Nobody in the world would want to be anyone else except perhaps a man who was going to be hung, and I don't believe he would until he got square with 1 or 2 people concerned." "I know what you mean," he went on a moment later. "The paintings and all that. Of course I'd like to have those, and who's saying that I won't have them someday? Of course I'd like to do lots of things that I can't do now, but I'll tell you this, Styles. Perhaps you know it, and perhaps you don't. Those people waste an awful lot of time thinking that the rest of us would like to be them." For the moment, Styles had to confess that he was disappointed. Had he given Exberger, the night before, credit for humility which he had not felt, or had that humility been so superficial, so purely a matter of trivial pride, that one night had destroyed it? It took him a minute to guess what actually had happened. The humility in the presence of Puller's great hall had been genuine enough, but, humbled as he had been, Exberger could never be humbled enough to feel really inferior. Puller's unexpected magnificence had opened his eyes, but it could never induce him to worship Puller. It had merely widened his plans. To be a Puller had simply become one more memorandum that he had jotted down in his mind and added to his one real and ever-growing ambition of being Exberger. Every one of his friends to whom he had talked of this man had given Styles a different idea of him, yet every one of them, like Styles himself, had not been able to deny some sort of admiration for him. Whether Exberger really did have that thing called brains, Styles did not know. Probably never would know. Possibly always would have his doubts, but, as Rose had said, there stood his success, visible, incontestable. For Exberger, however, the subject of Pullerities had merely begun. "You see those kind of people in my business, just the same as you do everywhere, and when they get tired of everything else, what do? Where do they come? To the theater, just as I do, just as you do, yourself." With a grin, Styles saw that, lacking evidence of great wealth, or, perhaps, having a newspaper past, he himself was not considered a Puller. He did not quarrel with a status which enabled him to receive more of Exberger's views on the class. "There are even 1 or 2 people of that sort right in the show business, arty people and all that," Exberger went on. "That is, in a way there are, for most of them get sick of it soon enough. But what can they do? What could I do if I went to some big bank or some big factory and asked to begin by being president? Yet that's what they want to do when they try to get into the show business. They want to teach us in 6 months what we've learning a what we've been learning a lifetime and haven't learned yet. Nevertheless, it's been done, insisted Styles, even in the banking business. It's certainly been done in war. They may think they've learned something about it from study, from books. Books, yes, exploded Exburger, with sudden and unexpected force. But what kind of books? I don't mind books. Give me the right kind of a book, and I'll sit up till morning to read it. But the minute those people try to run shows, what do they want to put on? Some Polish thing that nobody ever heard of, even in Poland. They don't want to see that bunk themselves. When they give a big dinner party, where do they go? To the Winter Garden. But they seem to think that everybody else ought to want to see their long-haired dramas. Let them have it if they want it, but not on my money. If that's what they want, let them come across. If those people would guarantee me a house for 2 weeks, just 2 weeks, mind you, I'd dramatize the whole damn golden treasury of English verse and get Fred Stone to play it. Where, demanded Styles, laughing, did you ever hear of the golden treasury of English verse? It's in your own sitting room, retorted Exburger. I read it this morning before you got up. The Turk in his tent and all. Styles, he went on, you've got brains enough if you'd only use them. Why, just since I've been up here, I've seen enough that was never written in books to make a dozen good plays. Do you want me to write one of them? Asked Styles. Well, I don't know, Exburger had to confess. You'd probably call it Soul's Slumber, and make it tell all about some man who spent his time fretting because he wasn't somebody else. Anyway, asked Styles, have you made up your mind whether or not you will stay over Sunday? You'd better. I'm going to town on Monday myself. I suppose we might as well, replied Exburger. I telephoned to the office from the garage. They'd been searching all over the country, wondering where I was. Everybody was asking, but nothing seems to have happened. What does Rose say about it? She said last night, replied Styles, that 7 o'clock this morning was going to see her seated on the station platform, ticket in hand, waiting for the 9 o'clock train. But she's still here. At least she was when we left. That's Rose all over, said Exburger in a lower tone. She's a good girl, but you can never tell from one minute to another what she will do. She says herself she doesn't know what she wants. Hello! Fieldsy has got her cows out again. They had reached the bridge near the house, where the stream was now running on as calmly as if nothing had ever happened. Except for the matted grass and the patches of thick, caked mud in the road, the brook had kept its own secret. Just now it had broken out of the mine. How it had broken out of the mine, how it had filled its new channel, and how it had taken up again with the old, there was nothing to show any more than there had been 60 or 70 years before, when Bugby had sworn and old Major Crater had chuckled. With his 3 guests, Styles had already made a trip of exploration that morning, but, except for the scattered puddles, there had been little to see as a result of the mine's eruption. A few rotted fragments of beams like those they had found in the upper passage, a few bits of dark blue cloth so water-soaked and so featureless that they might have been woven 3 years before, and might have been woven 100. Now, however, 2 of Mrs. Fields's cows were eating the soaked green grass of the meadow with a relish heightened by their 2 long weeks of confinement. The third, the mother of the little black calf, was sitting under an old gnarled apple tree, putting her son in shape for his next phase of life. Slick, slick, she sneered, she seemed to be saying, as, with waves of her head, she ran her tongue from one end of his little black body to the other. This rough old coat, slick, slick, was good enough for the slick, slick mine. But now that you're out, slick, slick, when folkses will come to see you, you've got slick, slick to clean up. I can't see that they're blind, remarked Styles. Blind? Replied Exburger. I should say not. Look at the old girl go to it. When they reached the house, Rose was walking under the trees with Baumgarten. Exburger joined them, but Styles went on into the house, where Mrs. Fields met him mysteriously in the hall. She had something big and lumpy under her apron, and, with a nod of her head, she beckoned him to follow her into the kitchen. There, looking to the right and to the left, she drew out a brass box, green with tarnish and mould. Styles took it and looked at it curiously. In the scrollwork of the hammered cover he could see faint letters. He pointed them out to Mrs. Fields, and she scrubbed them a bit with her apron. "I found that down in the meadow this morning," she said. "It must have been washed from the mine." The work of her apron had brought out the letters with some distinctness, and Styles pointed to them again. "Can you read those?" he asked. Without the affectation of spectacles, Mrs. Fields shook her head, and Styles went out to the group on the lawn. He held out his treasure. "Mrs. Fields found this. It was washed from the mine." He handed the box to Rose, who turned it round and round slowly. "Why, there are letters on it!" she cried. Exberger looked at it eagerly, and Styles smiled. "R-E," read Rose. "What is it? Latin?" "It's Spanish," said Styles, and he read the letters hammered into the scrollwork on the box. "Recuerdos. Recuerdos. That means keepsakes." They stood looking on that solitary relic in silence. At last Rose asked in a rather faint voice, "But how did it get there? Who did it belong to?" "A lady, I imagine," said Styles. "It might have been Mrs. Fields's great-great-grandmother. It might have been mine." They looked again at the little brass box. Then Exberger asked, "Aren't you going to open it?" Styles did so. "Nothing," he said. Baumgarten stood a place away from the others. "That part of the story," he suggested, "I didn't hear. What did you think you would find?" "Nothing," said Styles. Chapter 31. Baumgarten was fidgety after dinner that night. "Say, what do you think?" he asked at last. "Shall we have another fire?" "Righto," said Exberger. "Let's have Fieldsy in and get her to tell us the story of her life." Styles looked at his watch. "By the way, Baumgarten," he said, "Mrs. Fields says that a messenger came up this afternoon to have you call up New York. I'm afraid there's no telephone nearer than town. Will you walk down with me?" Baumgarten looked at him a moment. "I'll come," he said, shortly. As they fell into step in the road, Styles remarked, "Of course there wasn't any message." "I understand that," replied Baumgarten gruffly. "Going to sell the place, are you?" "Yes," replied Styles, rather astonished. He thought a moment and then added, "I presume you don't want to buy it now?" "I will take it or leave it, Styles," replied the other man quietly. "I never go back on my word." There might have been a note of real resentment in his tone. Styles understood that he would never know what had been written on that slip of paper that he had refused to look at, but the resentment, if it really existed, extended only to that one transaction. Otherwise, Baumgarten was friendly enough. "Giving up on your idea of living here yourself?" he asked. "I'm old," answered Styles, "too old to learn. If I were Puller it would be all right, but I haven't the figure for tweeds. I thought I could do it. I thought I was sick of New York." "If it gets in your blood, it never gets out," interrupted Baumgarten quickly. "Take Rose, now. She's always been talking about a house in the country." "She told me she had," answered Styles, quietly. He had finally learned that frankness was the only policy with the man. His companion did not misunderstand the brief sentence, and walked along moodily. "Of course," said Styles, "if I could have New York come to me now and then, as it has this week—" The old man broke in roughly. "Styles, New York will never come to you again as it has this week." Styles made no reply, and they walked in silence, again almost hostile. "About this meeting," suggested Baumgarten, quickly. When a man goes out to fight a duel, said Styles, he takes along a friend who knows something about pistols. When he goes to talk business, he takes a friend who knows something about business. I ought to know something about it, replied Baumgarten. He added, You heard your answer down in the mine, didn't you? Ask him for 40,000, let him beat you down to 25, then stick like a burr. As if he were planning a sale in his own New York office, Baumgarten began once more to talk smoothly and confidently. 9/10 of the land in this town is owned by members of a corporation known as the Eden Realty Company. I knew that, said Styles, but how did you know? Baumgarten snorted. I don't do things blind. I found that out the day I came. It is a voluntary association, incorporated under the law of the state of Massachusetts, and empowered to do about everything in the world except commit murder. Actually, it's an estate owners' protective league designed to keep out the roughnecks. The minute I found that out, I knew there'd be nothing doing with Puller from me. That's why I came directly to you. It made me mad in a way. You don't call yourself a roughneck, do you? Asked Styles. I'm no lily of the valley, replied Baumgarten. At the judge's house, Puller and his brother-in-law were waiting stiffly in the old parlor, and the four bowed silently with the ridiculous formality of men who may have seen one another all day, but meet at night to transact business. The judge came in behind the others, a suspicious twinkle in his eye. He was going to enjoy this scene. Styles saw no reason why time should be lost. Without beating around the bush, he began, I understand that you gentlemen and others are prepared to purchase my property. Am I correct? There was a silence. Puller looked at old Colonel Cady, and the latter cleared his throat. You are correct. Well then, continued Styles, I have drawn up a deed. He took a paper from his pocket and handed it to Puller. Puller opened his eyes as he read it. By any chance are you a lawyer, Styles? No, replied Styles, but I speak the language. Perhaps you had better read it, suggested the judge, and Puller began. Know all men by these presents that I, Andrew Styles, of the city and county of New York, in the state of New York, for divers good cause and considerations thereunto moving. Puller looked up. I guess I can skip this, he suggested. The others nodded, and he went on. Especially for the sum of $1 and other considerations received. Just a moment, interrupted Colonel Cady. We can hardly proceed until we know what the other considerations are. May I suggest, replied Styles, that before we touch on that point you read the conditions attached. Puller turned over the sheets, mumbling hurriedly over the formal phraseology. Is that what you mean? He asked. Said members of the said Eden Realty Company do agree and covenant? Styles nodded, and Puller read aloud. Said members of the said Eden Realty Company do agree and covenant, collectively and individually, and do hereby bind themselves by acceptance of this quitclaim deed to the following reservations. 1. No mining or other enterprise for gain or profit, with the exception of agriculture, husbandry, horticulture, or herding, shall ever be practiced in or on the said property, and on violation of this cause, all title in said property shall revert to the grantor or his heirs or assigns. 2. A cottage erected on any part of said property at the expense of the said Andrew Styles may be maintained for the benefit of one Mary Jane Fields, widow of Asahel Fields, supplied the judge promptly, and Puller wrote it into the deed. And by her occupied during her lifetime or pleasure. 3. Access to and the right to take from the said property any books, furniture, documents, monuments, relics, or any other articles of historical or artistic interest whatsoever shall be given at any time to Judge Abner A. Tyler of the said town of Eden in recognition for his faithful stewardship of said property and other property of the present and previous title holders. Puller looked up from the sheets. "My word, Styles!" he exclaimed. "Is this a quitclaim or your last will and testament?" "Both," replied Styles, "so far as Eden is concerned." Puller continued his reading. 4. A plot to be designed by said Andrew Styles and not to exceed 1 acre, comprising the sites of both the old and new Crater mansions, so called, shall be held in perpetual trusteeship by said Abner A. Tyler and such successors as may be hereafter appointed. All houses, barns, stables, granaries, and other buildings whatsoever now standing on the said plot shall be raised at the earliest practicable moment, and the ground so graded as to remove all traces of such buildings. The expense of this action will be borne by the said Andrew Styles. Thereafter no buildings or edifices of any kind shall be erected on such plot, with the exception of a memorial to be designed and designated by the said grantor Andrew Styles. Puller looked up. "That seems to be all." "That is all," replied Styles. Colonel Cady was stroking his mustache. "You have made a good many conditions, Mr. Styles." "Those are the only conditions on which I will sell." Said the colonel. A long pause followed, and then he suggested, "Now as to the other considerations. I take it for granted that you do not mean to sell your property for $1. Styles smiled, but for a moment he did not reply. "Gentlemen," he said at last, I may say that it has come to my ears that you would be willing to pay $25,000. Puller and Cady looked blank. Baumgarten and the judge smiled. "The property, you understand," said Colonel Cady slowly, "has no such intrinsic value at all. There are merely certain abnormal circumstances which have given it what I may call a fictitious value." He looked toward his brother-in-law and made the slightest motion of his head. Puller spoke. "Is that your price, Mr. Styles?" "Are the conditions otherwise acceptable?" insisted Styles. The brothers-in-law looked at each other. "I think so," said Puller. "Well, gentlemen," said Styles quickly, "the conditions, as Mr. Cady says, are abnormal. I am not a philanthropist, neither am I a blackmailer. 3 weeks ago the price of the property was $7,000. $7,000 is the price today." "You're a fool, Styles, an absolute fool," remarked Baumgarten as, half an hour later, they walked up the dark village street. "That," said Styles, "is one of the things I now can afford to be. It is one of my new luxuries." "It's a strange luxury," muttered Baumgarten, "but I don't see what you wanted me for." Styles laughed. "I thought you'd enjoy it." "I did," replied Baumgarten. "It was regular stage stuff, and I'll have to grant," he added a moment later, "that if you wanted to be such an ass, you did it with style. I'll bet you've even got a picture of the memorial." "I have," said Styles simply. "I've enjoyed that too. The place where the houses stood will be leveled and turfed and a small stone put up." "With your name on it?" "With nobody's name on it," answered Styles stiffly. He did not intend to say more, but he was, at the moment, in rather theatric mood, and he drew from his pocket an envelope. "This is what it will be." Puller took it and stopped to read in the faint light of one of the street lamps. On the envelope was a rather neat sketch of a simple stone, and on it the plain inscription, "Here lived and died an American family." The instant that he had given the envelope, Styles regretted it. If Baumgarten should laugh, He believed that he would strike him. But Baumgarten did not laugh. He handed it back to Styles and walked on without a word. "Styles," he said a moment later, "I told you that you had something worth more than that copper mine." Styles did not ask what it was, and he did not have to, for Baumgarten went on. "Class, Styles, class." After that, almost anything could be said between the two men, and Baumgarten knew it. "Styles," he said slowly, "you know why I ask. Are you going to marry Rose Fuller?" "Yes," answered Styles quietly. Chapter 32. Judge Tyler walked up the platform of the Eden station to find Rose and Styles looking up the track for the 9 o'clock train, but the presence of Styles, in clothes which had lain in his trunk for 3 weeks, did not seem to surprise him. He seemed more concerned to explain, almost shamefaced, his own presence. "I mistrusted you'd all be leaving this morning. So, you're going too?" "Yes," said Styles. "To stay now would be anticlimax." The word seemed to do for the judge as well as another, for he was looking back over the hills with dreams of his own. I thought so. Your grandfather, old Major Crater, was just such a one. He'd be here for months, content as a mud turtle, then, poof, he was off." Exberger, with Baumgarten's help, had been trying to draw out from the reticent station agent the number of weeks which would probably be elapsed before a freight car could be secured to take his motor back to the city. But at sight of the judge, he came up and held out his hand. "Judge, how are you?" The judge looked him up and down as he always did. "In the words of the Felsted Courier," he said, "I see you're leaving our midst." "Yes," laughed Exberger, "but, Judge, let me whisper you something. Just as soon as I get things right, I'm going to come back here and buy me a nice little farm." "Yes," replied the judge slowly. "Yes, I've heard men say that." Baumgarten joined them with twinkling eyes. "Judge," he said heartily, "do you ever get down to the big city?" The judge looked over the hills. "No," he said slowly. "No, I don't go away any more." He did not convince his hearer any more than Styles had done the first day. "Nonsense, Judge!" exclaimed Baumgarten. "The trouble is that unless you know the inside, you never see New York as you ought to have seen it." He reached into his pocket and drew out a card. "There's my telephone number. Now, some fine day, you make up your mind. Just get on a train and come down. We'll show you the time of your life, a bang-up dinner, a show, and then Exberger here will take you behind the scenes." The judge seemed unmoved, and Baumgarten thought the inducement misunderstood. He repeated, "Ever been behind the scenes in a theater, Judge?" The old man looked over the hills, and at last he smiled faintly. "Behind the scenes in a theater?" he asked. "Just one. It was in Rome, Italy." He mused a moment over the recollection. "There was a fella." The end. This audiobook is dedicated to Mrs. Dragon, the mother of Galara Dragon of the Ultima Dragons, so that her name shall forever be associated with Craters, and I think she knows why. The end. Well, that was quite an interesting book. Hard to put a genre to it. I think the review from the mid-20s said it was a mystery. Strange cast of characters in that little drama. And hey, Tito von is it Tito von Falafel? Welcome in. Appreciate you coming here to lurk. If you're still here, I appreciate it. Oh, and thank you for contributing to the community challenge. Yes, really appreciate it. And so that's the end of CRATER'S GOLD. It's wild to think about, the world these books came from. How different it was. What? It was... Okay, it was 1919 that it was printed. I don't know why I said it was the 20s earlier. And, ooh, there's a frontispiece. I don't know if I showed that. I think it's Baumgarten trying to get styles to sell. I remember when they did colored frontispieces in books. I assume it's in color. Interesting, multiple. No, the same previous owner wrote their name on more than one page. Isn't that peculiar? Well, now that we're done, we can put the cover back on, I dare say. Looking a little worse for the wear. Interesting. No writing on the back flap of the dust jacket. No, they call it a mystery, see? An amusing mystery story. Well, that was fun. I reckon. Okay, it was just a little over an hour. I didn't realize we had less to go to finish it this time. I wonder if what's his name? Philip Curtis. I wonder how many other books he wrote. Well, next time I do an audiobook, I'll probably make it something. Well, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't say something more mainstream, but something in a more immediately accessible genre. Maybe I'll do another horror book. It seemed to be alternating horror and mystery, but I like horror a lot. But I won't start another audiobook for a bit, because I don't want to do too many streams on top of a full-time job and find myself burnt out. So, I'll go ahead and find somebody to raid, but as for what's coming up on stream, tomorrow I still don't have a phone, so I don't know, tomorrow we'll either continue the Doom reboot or finish Bruxina Luana. And then on Sunday we'll do whichever one we don't do tomorrow, and soon we'll start another longer game. And well, certainly a week from Sunday either way. And as for Short Horror Saturday this week, I don't know, I'd been planning to do a stream of like 4 or 5 horror fishing games, because that's a subgenre now. And a few in multiplying on itch. Maybe that'll be a good thing to do this weekend. Alright. Let's see who's still online. She's not online anymore. And we rated him not that long ago. About yeah, it's unfortunate all the people who rate me I didn't get to rate them back. Let's raid. Oh, good lord. Someone's playing Leisure Suit Larry 7. That sounds family friendly. Captain Jax is playing Final Fight. The arcade version. I was quite partial to that in the arcades back when I was, I don't know, quite young. I mean, it was no bad dudes, but the first beat 'em up I fell in love with. Yeah. Am I right? No, I do not. Let us copy and paste, that we may avoid mistakes. There we go. Once again, thank you all for coming to enjoy my silly streams of audiobooks. And I appreciate all the chatters, and I appreciate all the lurkers. You guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and polls and random stuff. And you can find VODs of my past streams up on YouTube. And I hope that everybody has a good night. If you find yourself in possession of a house, know when to sell it and when to hold on to it. And in the world we currently live in, the answer is always hold on to it. But all that aside, have a great night. Say hi to Captain Jax. And I'll see you guys tomorrow for, well, some monster killing fun either way.